Hello learners, this session is on the process of interpersonal communication. Before you sit down for the lecture, I suggest you read thoroughly the write-up on the topic. You will find the write-up in the course content. Now let's get on with our lecture. I have for you two models on interpersonal communication. I feel the process of interpersonal communication can be best explained with these two diagrams. Right? Let's start with diagram number 1. You will see that the diagram has 5 elements. There is a sender, there is a channel, there is a receiver, and there is noise. Right? Now, in this particular diagram, the sender is divided into two entities, the brain as well as the encoder-decoder device. Same for the receiver. Decoder, encoder device as well as the brain. In real terms, decoder, encoder and the brain is housed in the same individual. It's the same individual. For convenience sake, we are kind of breaking it down to explain it in detail. So, essentially there are 5 elements: sender, receiver, sign, channel, and of course noise. Now, this is one of the earlier models and perhaps the most common model or the most often used model to try and explain the process of interpersonal communication. And this does a fairly good job. I am not dismissing it outright. But let us first look at how this model or this diagram explains the process. The sender has thoughts, ideas, emotions, information to transmit. Right? These thoughts, ideas, emotions, information, whatever, originates in the sender's brain. Right? In one of the sender is one of the interlocutors. It originates in the sender's brain. Now, the sender wants to transmit them, convey them to the receiver. How can he do it? Well, there is only one way. Those thoughts, that information, those ideas, those emotions that the sender is seeking to convey to the listener or the receiver has to travel through a channel to reach the receiver. Now, thoughts, emotions, ideas, feelings cannot travel on their own. They need to be converted into something that can travel. That's where the encoder-decoder apparatus comes into play. The encoder-decoder apparatus, the vocal cords, our tongue, lips, teeth, ears, right? The ear drums and accompanying mechanisms, all together become the encoder-decoder apparatus. Why am I saying it is encoder-decoder apparatus? Because every encoder is in reverse a decoder as well. When one is sending out an information, it functions, the apparatus functions as a encoder. when one is receiving information, the apparatus works as a decoder. So, it functions as both encoder and decoder. So, the brain has a thought. Thoughts cannot travel. If thoughts could travel, all we had to do was to think the thought and it would automatically get deposited in the receiver's brain, right? If that was possible, then we wouldn't need language, we wouldn't need a code. All we had to do was think and the other person will catch our thoughts. That is telepathy. That's still in the future. As of now, we need a vehicle for our thoughts, for our ideas, for the information we seek to convey to travel through the channel. Right? The channel, as I have said previously as well, is either air or wire or a combination of air and wire. So, my idea, if I am the sender, I have an idea, I formulate the idea into signs, right? I encode the idea into signs, and I then convey these signs or send these signs on to the receiver via the channel. What are these signs? They are both verbal and non-verbal. Our words are acoustic pulses, right? When we say utter something, our oral system converts our thought into sound pulses which can travel. Without these sound pulses, my thought wouldn't reach you, right? These thoughts reach you because I have a vehicle to send them across in. I have a vehicle can carry my thoughts to you, and without a vehicle, thoughts will not be transmitted, and signs are those vehicles. Non-verbal signs, verbal signs are our words, the language, it may be any language, your native tongue, your second language, your foreign language, whatever, any language you use. In addition to that, there are non-verbal signs also. Look at me, I am using my hands, I am using my face, I am using, you are reading from my posture as well, right? So, the package of signs consisting of verbal and non-verbal cues or behavior travels, and they are packaged by the encoder decoder mechanism in us, right? The thought is taken over by or sent or passed on to the encoder decoder, then encoder decoder then converts it into a package of signs that can travel and send it across, right? It travels through the channel and reaches the encoder decoder mechanism of the receiver. The encoder decoder mechanism of the receiver, as far as the receiver is concerned, it functions as the decoder. It receives these incoming signs, whether verbal or non-verbal, and decode them into messages, into thoughts, into ideas, right? It decodes them into messages and passes them on to the brain, right? Let me say this again. Incoming messages are first perceived by the decoder, right? And here the decoder is not just the oral mechanism, even your eyes function as a decoder, because for many non-verbal cues, the eyes are the decoders, right? So, you perceive signs coming towards you, the decoder decodes everything it perceives and passes on what it thinks it has decoded or whatever it has decoded on to the brain to make sense. Let me repeat. in regular interpersonal communication, you don't break down the person in the interlocutors into brain and encoder and decoder devices and so on and so forth. It's interlocutor 1, interlocutor 2, communicator, communicatee, sender, receiver. So, the sender's message is encoded, sent through the channel, received by listener, decoded, and he or she makes sense of the message. In this particular diagram, this element noise, remember we talked about noise earlier, right, is inevitable, right? You can't wish it away. There is nothing one can do about completely doing away with noise. That is not possible. In this diagram, noise acts on the channel. So, while your package of signs or packet of signs are traveling through the channel, they are acted on, the packets are acted on by noise. It could be environmental noise, is essentially external noise. It's acting on the channel, it's essentially external noise. Now, this goes back and forth. The receiver then encodes a response to what has been received and sends it back to the sender. And the sender then in turn functions as the receiver. He or she in turn responds to the received reply, and this goes on back and forth. The desired result, whose result? The initiator's result is achieved. This is a back and forth process. If you go by this model, communication is a very simple and straightforward act. If you encode properly and the receiver decodes it properly, making allowances for noises or noise acting on the channel, communication is a fairly simple, straightforward act and it's a foregone conclusion. Desired result is a foregone conclusion. But if you have impaired abilities to think, or your thought processes are not good enough or sharp enough or rich enough, or your decoder or encoder mechanism is flawed for some reason, then encoding wouldn't be appropriate or good. As a consequence, there could be faulty decoding by the receiver and the message could be warped or misunderstood. But if encoding and decoding is perfect, right, is good, then communication should not be a problem. Communication should be as easy as children playing. It's quite simple, it's quite straightforward. But we all know that communication is not that easy. We all know that communication is quite complex. We all know that communication is very challenging. And we all also know that ambiguity and confusion and misunderstandings and miscommunication is quite common in interpersonal interactions, despite being able to encode and decode accurately, appropriately, well. So, if you go by this diagram, if you are healthy enough, if you have enough thoughts in your mind, you can communicate. And if I am healthy enough, in the sense my encoder decoder mechanisms are not compromised, and I also have a thinking mind, I can easily communicate with you, right? It's just a matter of you encoding your thoughts and sending it across to me, and I decoding it and then reacting it till a desired result is achieved. But the truth of the matter is, it is not that simple or easy. It's quite the opposite. And I have a few favorite sitcoms, that I watch regularly, English sitcoms. There was one particular serial that I was following very closely. I quite liked it. But during one episode, somewhere in the episode, one of the characters in the sitcom made a statement, the following statement. It went like, I quote, "I work the graveyard at the post office. I work the graveyard at the post office." I was a little taken aback. I was confused. Did I not hear it properly? Yes, he did say, "I work the graveyard at the post office." What does he mean by that? What has a graveyard got to do in a post office or with a post office? How are they connected? I couldn't make sense of that utterance. What was this person saying? Right? Did I not encode it? Did I not decode it properly? Yes, I think I decoded it properly. I went back and listened to it again. Yes, I heard what he said. Did he not encode it? Yes, of course he encoded it well. Right? We are both fairly proficient or more or less at the same level of proficiency as far as the language being used is concerned. That is, in this case, it was English. Right? Then where did I go wrong? Encoding was right. Decoding was right. Right? According to this model, I should not have there should be no confusion. I should have understood the utterance, the statement. It should not have functioned as a barrier, right? But it did. It did not have the desired effect. Ambiguity persisted. I was confused. I lost thread of the story. And I kind of lost interest in that episode, right? But it is still bothering me. So later in the day, I mentioned it to my teenage son, and he smiled at me and said, "Look, Dad, graveyard shift in the context of a workplace refers to the midnight shift." It's as simple as that. It has got nothing to do with the graveyard as such, right? There is no graveyard in the post office or near the post office. The post office has not shifted to the graveyard. The graveyard has not shifted to the post office. There are no graves. There are no ghosts. Nothing. All it means is it's the midnight shift, right? It was not a encoding, decoding error issue. It was much, much more than that, right? If according to this diagram, the one that we are looking at, miscommunication, ambiguity, breakdown, misunderstandings can happen only if there is a serious problem in either encoding or decoding. In this instance, there was no such problem. Still, I couldn't successfully make meaning. I couldn't make sense of what was being said. I lost interest. I was confused, right? I was a little disturbed also that I couldn't make out what was being said. So, that example illustrates the fact that, or the point that I have been making, that communication cannot be just a matter of encoding and decoding, however well that is done. However well that is done, it cannot be just a matter of encoding and decoding. Diagram 2 is actually a modified version of diagram 1. It has the same elements and it adheres more or less to the process explained earlier. However, there are some differences. There are some changes, variations. Before I start talking about it, I would like to mention that this particular diagram, there is always a channel and there is always noise, right. So far, this looks very much like earlier model in terms of elements, in terms of the process. But if you look closely, if you take a closer look at this particular diagram, it would reveal several differences, and those differences, they are the key to understanding the process of interpersonal communication. What are those differences? I can list three types of differences. First type, if you look at a screen, on the screen I have signs, right, emanating from the communicator. These are signs, various signs. Please count the number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right. Representative, 8 signs emanating or put out or transmitted by the communicator. How many reaches the communicatee? Let us count the signs the communicatee perceives, or signs that have reached the communicatee. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There is obviously there is a reduction in the number of signs received by the communicatee. What could have happened to these signs then? Obviously, they were lost in transit, right. I sent out 8, you received only 6. Where did the other 2 go? We don't know, but they were lost. They are lost, right? They are lost, right. This loss will significantly affect the communicatee's ability to decode the message. These messages, or a communicatee decodes a message based on the signs he or she is perceiving, is receiving, right. So, if he or she, the communicatee, receives only 6 signs, her decoding is based on those 6 signs. Doesn't matter how many signs the communicator had actually originally transmitted. So, first difference in this is, in the previous model there was no mention of such loss in transition, right. There was no mention of fewer signs reaching the receiver. The assumption was that everything that was sent by the communicator would automatically reach the receiver, though there would be some impact en route because of noise, on account of noise. But here we are noticing that there is a significant reduction in the number of signs received or perceived by the communicatee, and that will result in or will have an impact on the way on the recreation of the message or the decoding of the message. Decoding is dependent on what is perceived or what is received. If you receive only 6, you decode only 6. Doesn't matter how many the communicator send out, right. This problem could essentially be because of either flawed encoding. If the encoding, if there is a problem in encoding the message, probably it could contribute to that particular sign not reaching the communicatee. Let me give you a quick and simple example. See, there has to be a certain rhythm, certain pace, certain volume in our utterances, right? And these factors have to be appropriate enough to carry to the communicatee. But some people have this habit of mumbling. I am just trying to illustrate this point, right? Mumbling. So, technically, theoretically, the speaker has put out the sign, put out a word, but it is so mumbled, or you know, he or she is speaking the volume is so low that the communicatee did not receive it. It was lost. I hope I have made my point clear, right? It could be faulty encoding. Another reason could be strong channel interference. Traveling through the channel is compromised so badly that anything traveling through it is going to be distorted heavily. Then you could expect a loss of signs, fewer signs actually getting through this channel interference to the communicatee, right. So, fewer signs have a negative impact on the process of communication. See, when I want to say something, I am choosing my signs carefully, because if I have chosen 10 different kinds of signs, is because I firmly believe that I need a minimum of those 10. I need all 10 to convey my message effectively to the communicatee. And if 3 or 4 is lost and only 6 gets through to the communicatee, my message is already compromised. My message is already distorted, and the communicatee cannot be blamed for that, because he or she makes sense of what he or she sees or receives. I hope that first difference is clear to you now. The second difference, if you have noticed, let us go back to the diagram, is that some signs, the signs that reached the communicatee, some of the signs that actually reached the communicatee, they seem to have changed in terms of size and shape and value and so on and so forth. For example, look at this particular one. This arrow, when it reached the communicatee, has taken on a different shape, right. This particular sign, when it reached the communicatee, has again taken on a bigger size, right. Now, if you look closely at the other signs also, you will see there are signs, not all of them, not all the signs, some of the signs in transit en route get distorted into weaker or sometimes stronger or different shapes and sizes and values, right. That is a fact. When these signs undergo change in value, in shape, in size, the communicatee again has no choice but to decode what he or she receives or perceives. If you put out a particular sign with a particular value, but by the time it reached the communicatee, the value has changed or become distorted or diluted or strengthened or whatever, the communicatee will decipher, decode what he or she sees and not what actually you sent out. Again, it is not a communicatee's fault. He or she can do nothing else but decode what he or she sees coming towards her or is being transmitted to him or her. This is mostly on account of channel interference. This happens mostly on account of channel interference. If the channel interference is very high, if the channel is is not appropriate, it can seriously cause distortions of this kind. That is difference number 2. Now, difference number 3, and the most important one. We look at a diagram. Signs that a communicatee perceives, sees, which were not actually put out by the communicator. Look at this sign. This sign was not actually put out by the communicator, yet the communicatee sees it, right. This particular sign, again not put out by the communicator, but the communicatee sees it, and he or she factors that into the decoding process, right, making meaning process. Now, how does this happen? It happens because of two reasons. One, they are being transmitted, right, but we are not aware of it. We didn't choose to deploy them, but yet they are being deployed. Why? Probably because of factors like strong emotions or other internal barriers like preoccupation and so on and so forth. Most of these unconscious, most of these unconscious, non-deliberate signs are transmitted via non-verbal cues, voice, body language, and so on. The communicator is actually putting out those signs, right. It is not as if he is not putting, he is not aware of it. Unfortunately, he or she is not aware of it, but these signs are emanating from him or her and is being perceived or seen and decoded by the communicatee, right. The communicator has absolutely no control over these additional signs that are being put out by him unknowingly, unconsciously, and that is perhaps because of internal noise. For example, if you are very nervous while interacting with another person, without your being aware of it, your body will put out signs telling the recipient, the other person, that you are nervous. You don't have to hold a placard to say I am nervous. The other person can see or sense it for himself or herself. How? He can see your twitchy movements, your shifting eyes, your sweaty brow, your restless posture. Many such things give away the fact that you are nervous, and the communicatee includes that also in the process of making meaning. These signs were not actually deliberately put out, but they were put out without your knowledge, without the sender's knowledge. But there is another category of signs, right, which is again part of this third difference, where the communicatee, that is this person, the receiver, on account of his own internal noise, it could be fear, it could be prejudice, it could be selfishness, or it could even be a cultural thing. He or she imagines signs where actually there are none. So, the communicatee imagines non-existent signs because of communicatee's internal noise. In the previous thing, the communicator's internal noise was sending out messages without a communicator being aware of it. Here, the communicatee reads or sees or perceives messages as if they are coming from the communicator, but these signs are not there, they are non-existent and only a figment of the communicatee's imagination. But nevertheless, the communicatee includes those also in his meaning making, in making sense of the message, in his decoding. In other words, this particular model implies that communication is not a simple, straightforward, mechanical exercise of encoding and decoding signs. It is a complex process of making sense of an array of signs, both verbal and non-verbal. How does the process start? it starts with the communicator, that is the sender, deliberately selecting and transmitting a variety of signs to the communicatee to convey his message or her message. In addition to the signs that the communicator has deliberately put out, you have two more sets of signs. One, signs coming out from the communicator, involuntary signs. Two, signs that are not there, but still the communicatee sees it because of his or her internal noise. In addition to all this, this package is subjected to channel interference en route. Therefore, the array of signs the communicatee perceives and decodes is different vastly from the array of signs the communicator actually put out or transmitted. And the communicatee decodes the array he or she perceives, and meaning is made according to that decoding. Therefore, it is clear to you, if you look at the picture, it is clear to you that as a result of decoding, the communicatee arrives at a message which is highly unlikely to be the same as the original message. Look at this, this is the original message, this is the received message. The decoded message is highly unlikely to be the same as the original message, right? The received message thus is always different from the original intended message. The reaction to it, the response to it will also therefore may not be as desired. That is the problem. You react to what you have decoded or made sense of, and what you have made sense of is not essentially what the communicator really wanted you to. So, in interpersonal communication, this ambiguity, this misreading is inevitable. Good communicators realize this fact, accept it, recognize the challenge, and they compensate by deploying adequate signs and by other means. They compensate through various means to make their messages understood by the communicatee, understood the way they want it understood. Let me end this lecture by saying, communication is deemed effective when the communicator achieves satisfactory and intended response from the communicatee, and that is not an easy task. I have just explained why, right? You have to ensure, one has to ensure that the message you are sending out is understood the way you want it understood by the receiver. And that is a very difficult task, and that is why communication is perhaps one of the most difficult acts